Hello and welcome to the Australia Institute's Policy School. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm a research manager at the Institute, and I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to the custodians of this place who've been keeping alive culture and connection to country for many, many millennia. As with other episodes of Policy School so far, in this episode, we'll be talking about key issues and the current policy landscape, what the evidence-based research shows, barriers to reforming policy, the most persuasive arguments and key messages, and how to communicate cut-through facts and data to help you change minds. At the end of Policy School, you'll be able to confidently advocate for what needs to be done, explain why it needs to be done, and how we can all work together to achieve a more just, sustainable, and peaceful society. Just a few reminders, you can type in questions for Rod using the Q&A box, and you can upvote other people's questions if you'd like to see them answered. You can ask questions anytime, you don't have to wait until the end. And please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. Finally, this is a live event and it's being recorded. The video will be available on our website, australiainstitute.org.au afterwards. In this episode, we have Rod Campbell talking about fossil fuel subsidies. Rod Campbell is Research Director at the Australia Institute, and his work often focuses on the economics of fossil fuel industries. He's published numerous landmark reports as well as articles in peer-reviewed journals and has appeared as an expert witness in major court cases and planning processes. Welcome, Rod.
Thanks, Alice, and welcome to Policy School, everyone, and welcome to Policy School about fossil fuel subsidies. I'm particularly excited about fossil fuel subsidies and particularly excited that other people are excited enough to come here to talk about them so that hopefully you can talk about them more widely. Because as we'll get to at the end of this webinar, there's real chance for change on this big topic. I really think that community discussion and public debate about this topic can have a really big difference in the next few months in the lead up to the election. Letters to the editor, discussions in branch meetings, door knocking, water cooler discussions on this topic can really make a difference. So I'm really excited about giving this today, and also because it's such a big deal. Fossil fuel subsidies are a big deal for two reasons. They're the worst possible climate policy, and they're also costing the public a fortune. We could fund so many more nice things if we reeled in our fossil fuel subsidies. So to give you an idea of what we're talking about, I'll hit the share button. I think I've mastered this time. Hoping everybody should be able to see my opening slide there. Policy School, fossil fuel subsidies, and how to end them. Getting a few thumbs up there, so that's good news. So, Australia's fossil fuel subsidies, FFS, that's what it stands for, nothing else. So the Australia Institute puts out an annual estimate on how much state and federal governments subsidise fossil fuels, both fossil fuel producers and major users of fossil fuels. Our estimate for last year was $14.5 billion in the 2023-24 year, which equates to $27,581 every minute of every day. It's often hard to put big numbers in context. You know, millions sounds like billions, sounds like trillion, but this is a really big number. 14.5 billion is quite significant in the context of government budgets. It's $540 for every man, woman, and child in Australia. If you can imagine every person in Australia queuing up to hand over $540, that'd be quite a mountain of cash. It's more than we spend on the army. We'll look at that in a bit more detail later. But I bring it up not because I think we should spend more or less on the army, but in Australian public policy discussion, when we're really serious about something, we send in the army. When we're wanting to save flood victims in northern New South Wales, we send in the army. When we really think there's a domestic violence problem in the Northern Territory, we send in the army. And we send in the army because they are big and well-resourced. And they're big and can do stuff and well-resourced because we fund them. And what we're seeing here is if we phased out fossil fuel subsidies, we could have a whole other army. We could have an army of lawyers and social workers to deal with family violence. We could have an army of people to build more renewable energy. We could have a lot of nice things in Australia if we got rid of fossil fuel subsidies. So this is costing us a fortune, and it makes climate change worse. Fossil fuels, of course, coal, diesel, gas, oil, petrol, these are what is driving climate change. Chopping down trees and cows burping and farting and so on, like these are things that we need to pay some attention to, but climate change is being driven by fossil fuels. So if we are subsidizing fossil fuels, we are making the problem worse. So we know what fossil fuels are and we know why they're a problem. And let me just see if I can, oops. It's okay, I'll leave that there. But what is a subsidy? And I think it's really important if people are going to engage in this discussion, no matter what level, whether it's punching on social media or in a considered submission to a Senate inquiry, it's important to note that there's no strict definition of what is a subsidy or what is not a subsidy. There's no professional body of economists that goes around saying, yes, this is definitely a subsidy, this is not. In fact, there's quite a bit of disagreement and quite a bit of differing definitions about what's a subsidy and about what's a fossil fuel subsidy. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, those well-known greenie basket weavers, they think Australian fossil fuel subsidies run at $44 billion per year. They think that, well, the Australia Institute's estimate, as I said, is at 14.5 billion, and the Productivity Commission's estimate is at 1 billion. So you can see economists have vastly different definitions of what is a subsidy and what is not. But I think what's really important to realise is that there is quite a bit of debate about what does the word subsidy mean and not mean. But what there is not debate around is that these policies reduce the ability to government's ability to spend on public services, and they make climate change worse. So I think it's important not to get too hung up on the word subsidy. But I think the word subsidy is useful here because it allows us to bring in a wide range of policies that are causing some big problems and talk about them as a whole. It's worth noting, perhaps, how are these definitions so different? That the IMF is at 44 billion. Stop sharing for a second. How do we get to this point where the IMF is at 44 billion and the Australia Institute is at 14 billion, etc.? And the reason for it is the IMF include the costs of climate change, and they include the health costs of fossil fuel use. So particulate pollution from diesel and coal-fired power stations and the way that affects people's health in Australia's major cities, that's included in the IMF's number. It's not included in the Australia Institute's number. What we tend to look at is what's in black and white in Australian government budget papers or official documents. So the IMF do quite a bit of their own calculations. The Australia Institute's numbers come strictly from official government documents. And the Productivity Commission uses a different definition. We'll talk about. They exclude Australia's largest subsidy, which they don't like the word subsidy around it. They don't dispute its large cost, but they exclude a couple of things. They exclude a large tax break and infrastructure spending, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So let's go back to the slides. Hopefully you're back on there. So I've got up there the World Bank's definition of subsidies. It's basic, and they leave it pretty wide open. It's something that confers a benefit on a company or even a group of industries, and they include reduction of taxes paid or tax credits, and that'll be important later on. The Queensland Treasury is an example of an organisation that doesn't use the word subsidy a lot in terms of fossil fuels, but they make it really clear that Queensland provides a lot of infrastructure that helps the mining industry, mainly the coal industry. And Queensland Treasury is explicit that spending on mining-related infrastructure means less infrastructure on other spending, such as hospitals and schools. This is a real cost to the government and the community. So we include that as a subsidy. Queensland Treasury and the Productivity Commission probably don't, but we do. So lots of people have lots of different definitions. And, I think it's important to have a bit of a refresh. I wonder if for people younger than me, this may not seem obvious, but I learned economics in the late 90s and early noughties. And growing up in that time, subsidies were bad. It was almost unquestioned that we should not be subsidising things like manufacturing clothes in Australia or making cars in Australia. To be a real economist and to be taken seriously in a lot of public debate in the late 90s, maybe the 90s, noughties, etc., subsidies sounded like a bad word. It was almost a four-letter word. I mean, well, it's got a few more than four, but it was a really bad word. And that's why it triggers people of certain demographics, particularly within the public policy and economic space. They get really agitated about this word subsidy because it meant something bad in the 90s and noughties. Australia Institute polling has actually consistently shown that the public is actually pretty up for subsidies of most kinds. They don't see it as necessarily a bad thing, and maybe they never did. I haven't gone back through public opinion on subsidies through the 90s and so on. I think it'd be an interesting study, interesting for people like me, but probably not interesting for people like you. So let's move on. Back to the slides. So people get triggered by the word subsidies. So if you are having a discussion with people about this, you don't need to be hung up on the word. The point is that we should tax. The basic rule in economics is that you tax what you want less of, and you subsidise or you support, if you don't like the subsidise word, what you want more of. So we should be taxing fossil fuels, not subsidising them. And that's a pretty basic rule of economics and public policy. So what are Australia's fossil fuel subsidies? Let's have a look at some of the, I would say, less controversial examples of what is abundantly a fossil fuel subsidy in Australia. Here's a snip from the Queensland government's budget papers, a line item called the Frontier Gas Exploration Program, where the Queensland government is just giving $21 million to companies that are exploring for new gas projects. As we said at the top, fossil fuels are bad for climate. The International Energy Agency, every climate scientist you can name, the UNFCCC, everyone says we should not be opening new fossil fuel projects. We should not be unlocking significant new gas resources in the Bowen and Galilee basins. Yet Queensland government budget papers shows that the Queensland government, the Queensland public, is spending $21 million to do exactly that. Don't laugh at the Queenslanders though. Here's Coal Innovation New South Wales. This was a $100 million fund set up by the New South Wales government to promote coal, to promote technologies that would prolong the use of coal, particularly carbon capture and storage, which a lot of people might have heard of. And there's plenty of research on the Australian Institute website about how carbon capture and storage is really just PR for the fossil fuel industry. But Coal Innovation New South Wales also funds social research that's aimed at improving the public acceptance of coal. So something that's pretty obviously in the interest of the coal industry, set up with $100 million. It spent, what have we got here? It spent $27 million in 22-23. Still has a balance of $43 million. It'll still be around for a few years yet. This should be shut down immediately, and that money spent on almost anything else. Again, don't laugh at the Queenslanders and the New South Wales. We can't feel too smug down here in Victoria, because here in Victoria, where I'm coming to you from, we fund one of the stupidest fossil fuel projects you can possibly imagine. It's a little bit hard to see. This is I always like putting up snips from the actual policy documents. This is from the funding agreement between the federal and state governments to give money to two related projects that fund carbon capture and storage, and a project that's trying to turn Victoria's brown coal, Australia's dirtiest and worst quality coal, into hydrogen that will somehow be shipped to Japan. This was never likely to happen and never likely to work, and the Victorian and federal governments are spending, you can see there, $47 million on the carbon capture and storage part of it, and the hydrogen bit is another few tens of millions. So tens of millions of dollars going into promoting the use of Australia's worst coal. Just astonishing. Here's the Northern Territory government. This is a recent news. This is a recent news article. Oh, I should say, over on the right-hand side of these slides, I've got the cover of the Australia Institute's main fossil fuel subsidies report, and I'll show you a couple of other reports. That's a good one. That's the source for a lot of what we're talking about today, and it's got the original documents, links to the original documents in there. This news article about NT government signs deal with Tamboran Resources to buy Beetaloo Basin gas. That's not in our report. It'll certainly be in the next one. But there is, but the Northern Territory government does this a lot. The Northern Territory government has signed deals to buy billions of dollars worth of gas from otherwise uneconomic gas projects. And if you think about it like this, if you were starting a pizza shop, but you weren't quite sure if it was going to be viable, and the government came along and said, we'd like to buy $4 billion worth of your pizzas, we'll commit to doing that, well, that would suddenly make your pizza shop pretty damn viable. And that's exactly what's happened with a couple of gas projects off the Northern Territory. One of them got commitments for $4 billion. It's not clear how much this one is worth. This article goes on to speculate it could be around $1 billion. But, why would you be allowed to know? You're just the public who signs on to this. It's just astonishing. So it's time to talk about the big one. This is as Lord of the Rings go, this is the one fossil fuel subsidy to rule them all. And it's the one that most of the debate and most of the hope for change is around. And it's called the Fuel Tax Credit Scheme. And this sounds really boring. And I think that's not an accident. A lot of discussion around tax and economics is meant to make you tune out. But if you can force yourself through some of the pretty tedious jargon, you'll realize that what's happening here is a subsidy or a tax break worth tens of billions of dollars, mainly to multinational companies, could be about to be diverted to spending on public services. So pay attention, because this one really matters. It's really hot. It's going to be it could be a big election issue if you guys can get it out into the community a little bit more. So let's look at what it is. So the fuel tax credit scheme, here's just a snip from the Australian Tax Office website. Just got a pretty basic definition of it, where it's saying businesses get a credit for fuel tax. Basically, they get paid back the fuel tax. If you're using machinery, heavy vehicles, or vehicles off public roads and private roads. It depends on where you get the fuel, what fuel you use, and the activity that you're doing. So basically, some people pay fuel tax and some people do not. Now, who does and who does not has no particular economic rationale. If you're a tradie driving across town to help build a lost dogs shelter, you are paying the fuel tax. If you're a nurse driving to work to help save people's lives, you are paying the fuel tax. Most Australians are paying the fuel tax on all of their fuel, but not everyone. And it's important to emphasize how big this is. This is why this is the one subsidy to rule them all, and this is why there's so much excitement about it. I'm hoping you can feel the excitement in the webinar and out in public policy land. This is a snip from the federal government budget papers, and it's the top 20 programs by expense. This is the most expensive things that the federal government funds. And you can see the fuel tax credit is coming in at, was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at number 15. This is the 15th most expensive thing for the federal government. So I've probably kind of botched it with my red circle there, but you can see the next thing above there is government schools national support. So you can see the fuel tax credit is 9.8 billion or 9.9 billion and then 10.2. So we're talking about around $10 billion. The next thing up is federal government funding of public schools. If you'd like to double federal government funding of public schools, you could get rid of the fuel tax credit and you could do it right then. See another few things up there. Childcare subsidy. Geez, I've got a 3 and a 5-year-old. I would love to see an increase of 75% in childcare subsidies. Let's do it by abolishing the fuel tax credit scheme. Job Seeker is up there. We could basically almost double Job Seeker. If we got rid of all fossil fuel subsidies, you can see there, we could double Job Seeker and basically eliminate poverty in Australia. Conditions apply. And and I forgot to say, down the bottom there is army capabilities. There's the army. The army, when we're serious about doing something in Australia, we call in the army. The army costs a mere $9 billion. So here's another important point. The cost of the fuel tax credit scheme is getting bigger, and it's getting bigger fast. The dip in the graph there is around COVID, and it's mainly around accounting and some different public policy stuff. We're going to have a chat about that in questions if anyone's interested. The point is, this is increasing, and it's not increasing just because petrol and diesel prices are increasing. Treasury make it really clear in the budget papers. This is increasing because Australia is using more diesel. Now, I don't want to get too bogged into or diverted into wider climate policy, but there's something really wrong where a country that is trying to decarbonise, in its own federal government budget, we're looking at more diesel use, not less. The federal government is budgeting to use more fossil fuels, not less. And part of the reason is because we let the major users of diesel not pay fuel tax credits. Not pay fuel tax. So why is it so? Well, it is so because of who gets the fuel tax credit. And who gets the fuel tax credit? It's the mining industry. The mining industry is the abundant beneficiary of this subsidy. You have a look at this chart, it's straight out of Australian Tax Office data. Ore mining, that's mainly the iron ore industry. That's BHP, Rio Tinto, Gina Rinehart, Andrew Forrest. Andrew Forrest, to his credit, has said he doesn't need or want it. He'd be happy for this to be phased out. Haven't heard the same thing from Gina or BHP. The coal mining industry comes in next. This is $1.1 billion a year that helps make coal cheaper to dig out of the ground. This is the worst possible result from a public policy perspective. We are making the use of fossil fuels cheaper to produce more fossil fuels more cheaply. Disaster. You can see other industries do benefit from this. You can see transport comes in next, which is mostly the biggest chunk of that is trucking. Heavy vehicles on public roads get a credit, and another significant chunk of it is rail freight. And guess who the beneficiaries of most of the rail freight in Australia are? Oh, it's the mining industry. So the mining industry is really the big winner here. You'll see the small winners are agriculture, transport, and way off down the end, construction, and then things get laughably small from there. That's important to realise because the mining industry, you can see this is worth $3.5 billion a year to the mining industry, not including their chunk of rail freight. So it's worth nearly $4 billion a year to the mining industry. And so it's not a surprise that the lobbyists of the mining industry see this as almost priority number one. When there's been some discussion of changing this recently, and straight away you saw in the newspapers, there's Tanya Constable, the CEO of the Minerals Council, Australia's most powerful mining lobbyist, straight in there with opinion prices. Fuel tax will push up prices. What she's really saying is, if you made my members pay tax, somehow that would push up prices. It's a pretty dubious argument, but she was immediately backed in by none other than Australia's mining minister, Madeleine King. We're not changing the diesel fuel rebate. Farmers and miners get the rebate for vehicles that only operate on private roads not funded by the taxpayer. Did you get that? Let's go back here. The miners are getting $4 billion out of this. Farmers get a bit under $1 billion, but immediately it's always the mining industry and the farmers and the fishermen and so on. Don't be fooled. This is about the mining industry. There's no shortage of suggestions on how this could be tweaked to basically make multinational mining companies pay billions more and leave agriculture and fishers and so on unaffected. I think they should be paying the fuel tax too, but there's no shortage of options for a government that was serious about reducing fossil fuel subsidies to do this in a way that was not disruptive to industry and certainly not disruptive to the economy. But you see here, there's always this emphasis on roads, and that's probably worth talking about for a second, because discussion about this always veers into, oh, but isn't it about road funding? No, it's not about road funding. Back in the 1950s, Australia really did divert all of our fuel tax to road funding. There was a much stronger link in the 1950s between road funding and fuel tax. That was abolished in the 1950s. So, but 70 years on, we're still hearing that fuel tax is to pay for roads. No, it's not. Roads are funded when we build and maintain roads when there's a need for them. Nobody sits around looking at a pothole thinking, gee, there hasn't been enough fuel tax revenue lately. we're not going to fill in that pothole. No, if there's a need to build a road, if there's a need to fix a road, then that happens, and it happens out of general government revenue, consolidated revenue. Fuel tax gets paid into consolidated revenue, and it gets used to fund the whole range of government services, just like everything else. So you'll hear loads of whining about that the fuel tax credits are all about road funding. There is a very small portion that is, there's a very small exception. If you want to read about that, go to the report that's, oh, hang on, I'm not sharing my slides. Let's share again. There's a lot of detail on this. Oh, there we go. There's a lot of detail on this in the report in the right-hand corner there that we've written on the topic. But all of the lobbying about this, if you engage in debate on this, be prepared for this. So this is a website called the Fuel Tax Credit Alliance. Road taxes are for road users. Nonsense. It's not a road tax. And there's plenty of road users who also don't pay enough fuel tax. But you can see down the bottom there, there's all the, here's a lovely salt of the earth farmer looking woman. We wouldn't want to do anything she didn't agree with, would we? And down the bottom, you got grape and wine and the Farmers Federation and the seafood industry and tourism in North Queensland. Oh, they all sound nice. But then look at the left-hand corner. It's the Minerals Council of Australia. It's the mining industry. They've dragooned all these other industry lobbies in with them, and sure, they get some benefit out of it, but this is all about the mining industry, predominantly about coal and iron ore. This website's full of pictures of fishing boats and nice young women. 85% of the mining industry are men. And this is all from the Fuel Tax Credit Alliance website. But if you see the grey box there, it's authorised by Tanya Constable, the Minerals Council of Australia. It's all about the mining industry. So, and I think one last point to make on this before we move on, and the fuel tax credit scheme and road funding. I think the key point is taxpayers don't get to pick and choose what taxes they pay based on what services they use. I didn't use a Commonwealth-funded aged care facility this year. I can't walk into 7-Eleven and say, I don't want to pay the GST on my Slurpee because I didn't use an aged care facility this year. And that's what the mining industry want to be able to do. They want to be able to say, we don't use roads, so we shouldn't have to pay the fuel tax. Nonsense. You're paying the GST on everything that you use, regardless of what services you've used. So we can talk about that more in questions later. But so why is this so exciting now? It's because there is real hope for change on it. Here is an article from the Financial Review a couple of weeks ago, where basically it's community independent politicians who are saying in order that they will make changes to fossil fuel subsidies a key part of their negotiating with any potential government if they're in a minority government position. This is sending absolute panic through the mining industry. That's why you see those op-eds from the chief of the Minerals Council, because they know that if there's a minority government situation, there are some powerful crossbenchers who are basically saying, and they're going to say to their community members, we will take billions from BHP, we will take billions from Gina Rinehart, and we will spend it on things the community wants to spend it on. And I think the bigger picture is, wow, here is a massive public policy failing, fossil fuel subsidies, that Australia has made no progress on. We're going backwards, they're getting bigger. And we could be about to see independent and minor party politicians, we're saying the Greens have been very strong on this for a very long time, where we could, if the stars align, we could see real change to a major public policy problem brought to you by the crossbench and by minority government. And this feeds into something else we like saying here at the Australia Institute, that big problems can be solved. And the solutions to big problems usually aren't actually all that hard. They're usually pretty simple. It just needs the political will to do them. And so if the crossbench can pull off a massive reform like this and direct huge amounts of funding away from multinational coal corporations and towards things that people like, I think that will set a huge precedent that could really see Australia and Australia's political system and Australia's democracy make some big steps in the right direction. So it's over to you to help these politicians get this kind of word out, to have these discussions, to make sure people are understanding that this is what's at stake. It's nothing less than the climate and Australian democracy and the funding of my children's childcare that is at stake. So we might end it there and go to questions. And Alice.
Thanks, Rod. When you were talking about the Constable op-ed and the Madeleine King tweet, there was the argument that fuel costs would be higher if the subsidies weren't in place. And the first question we have is, how much more expensive would our fuels be without these subsidies?
So your fuels wouldn't be any more expensive. This would make zero difference at the pump to, I suspect, I'm sure there's some people from the Minerals Council listening, aside from them, this will make zero difference to anyone's fuel costs, to any punter's fuel costs. What they're talking about there, where they said, oh, this will increase prices, what they're trying to argue is that if in a nutshell, if farmers had to pay for their diesel, they would pass that increase along to the supermarkets, who would pass that along to punters. You'll note I encourage people to go and read the article. There's no effort to quantify this. Our colleagues over at the Grattan Institute have done that. They've proposed some pretty big reforms to this. I think their estimate was this would make about a 35-cent difference to the average family's weekly shop. So this makes no difference at all to anyone except for mining companies buying fuel and arguably people buying things from mining companies. But the last time I checked, not many people go down to the supermarket to buy 40,000 tonnes worth of iron ore. That's really major shipping companies and international commodity traders that do that. Those people might be interested, but Australian households should not be.
And put my audio back on. So if this doesn't have a direct impact on the voters, if removing it wouldn't have a direct impact on the voters, Gavin Miller asks, politically, why do governments subsidise? Why do governments continue to have fossil fuel subsidies in place?
Purely because of the political power of the mining industry. Anyone who was around in 2010 has seen what the mining industry, the power that the mining industry holds over major parties. They do it through political donations. They do it through jobs for mates. They do it with the threat of campaigns against them. And I think, I think it's worth going into that a little. Like, the last Premier of Western Australia now works for the mining industry. The last Premier of New South Wales now works for the mining industry. I think she was the last Treasurer of the Northern Territory now works for the gas industry. The last Treasurer of Western Australia now works for Rio Tinto. So it's not just political donations, but this power. The mining industry is immensely powerful because it has such tight networks within powerful organisations. Tanya Constable was originally a bureaucrat. She was from the Department of Industry. I worked with her on a couple of projects. She's a very capable bureaucrat. But you can bet that everyone in the Department of Industry knows that if they play their cards right, they could end up in a big gig like Tanya did. So it's not just donations. It's not just jobs here, one or two jobs here or there. It is hundreds, if not thousands of people within public service departments, within companies, within political offices, all of whom know that they could get a pretty sweet gig down the road, or their career could be pretty badly limited depending on how hard they go on the mining industry. So it's really about the political power of the mining industry rather than any economic rationale at all.
Mm. Which I think is related to a question from S. Madison, who says, coming up a level other than during a genuine national emergency, perhaps after the past decade, can you suggest any important area where voters permitting either of our major parties to form a majority government would advantage anyone beyond minority vested interests?
Look, I think it's a hot question, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to give it a one-word answer of no. Sorry, I can't remember which way the negation of it went. Can I think of a good reason to have majority government based on recent years? No.
Right. Well, we can head right on to the next question from Tim Diamond, who says, to what extent do fossil fuel subsidies overlap with subsidies and tax breaks for farmers and agribusiness? Does it create a bigger constituency for these policies beyond the resources industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I was speaking to a cattle grower not long ago about this, and he said, yeah, we benefit to the tune of about $15,000 a year. This is sort of medium-sized cattle grower out the back of Ballarat. He said it was definitely in the low. He didn't have. We're at a children's party. He didn't have his books in front of him, but he said low tens of thousands of dollars a year for a family cattle business. So they certainly want it. He said they could live without it, and that's where there's been proposals from Grattan and Climate Energy Finance. There's a few detailed proposals. There's references to it on our explainer document, looking at if you capped the claims for this at $100,000, $500,000, if you capped the claims for it at some level, then you'd basically see any family farm, any decent sized agricultural enterprise, any fishing enterprise, basically not affected, and big mining companies would be affected. I think the Climate Energy Finance estimate is if they capped it at $5 million per entity, then there'd be 8 mining companies affected, and it'd recover, I think $8 billion or something like that.
Hmm. But what about renewable energy producers and their subsidies?
Oh yeah, so I tried to get some cheap promotion of this webinar today by poking all of my trolls on Twitter, and they delivered yesterday by calling me a communist clown and asking what about renewable energy subsidies? Aren't they a thing too? Yeah, of course they're a thing. Yeah, we do subsidise renewable energy in Australia, and we should, because renewable energy is saving the planet and fossil fuels are destroying it. It's actually that simple. But here's one I prepared earlier because I thought this might come up. And the Australia Institute hasn't done the same study on renewable energy subsidies. I wouldn't mind doing it. I should say, like, our studies on this take a lot of effort. We go through every government budget paper from every state and federal government, and they're long and detailed. We do a fair bit of Control F, but it's really labour intensive. So we haven't gone through it and done the same thing for renewable energy. I'd kind of like to, but got limited resources. And why would I, when our friends over at the right-wing Centre for Independent Studies have done it for us? So Centre for Independent Studies, they're right into publicly owned nuclear energy, but they're really not fans of subsidies for renewable energy. Their estimate was $29 billion over 10 years, so about $2.9 billion a year. Just to go right back to the top, Australia Institute estimates fossil fuel subsidies at $14.5 billion a year. I think we can call them right-wing, we could call them pro-market, if you like. Centre for Independent Studies, just under $3 billion a year. I've read this study, obviously. Again, again, I think their definition of subsidy, it's not exactly what I would use, because as I've highlighted there, they're including money from governments and transfers from private entities to renewable companies as mandated by government policies. So, they're talking about the renewable energy target there, where energy companies have to buy some amount of renewable energy, and they have passed the cost of that onto consumers. So they're calling that a subsidy too. I probably wouldn't, but okay. I mean, it's certainly a support measure. But so based on their best efforts, renewable energy subsidies are a fraction, 1/5 of fossil fuel subsidies in Australia.
Mm. So we have a question from Mike Reynolds, who asks, why not remove the tax? Impact on productivity versus environment. Is that the equation that we're talking about here?
Are we talking about why not remove fuel tax altogether? Do you think that's the question? Or?
Oh, that's what it's written.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly seen people say that, let's get rid of fuel tax and tax other things. But I mean, fine. If you want to play fantasy football with the tax system, everyone can design a great tax system starting from scratch. And you can probably argue that if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of fuel tax and have a serious carbon price, I'd probably do that. But at the moment, the fuel tax raises quite a bit of revenue. I think it raises, off the top of my head, I think it raises about $30 billion a year. So it's not. It's not up there with income tax or GST or company tax, but it's a significant lump. Off the top of my head, I'd say to be 8% of the federal government revenue, somewhere between 5 and 10. So we should have it because it raises revenue. It's hard to avoid, and it discourages fossil fuel use. So fuel tax ticks quite a few boxes, even if you could argue there's lots of economists who argue that it's not a great idea because it's an input to a lot of businesses. Yeah, okay, but you tax what you want less of, and you subsidise what you want more of. We want less diesel use, not more.
Excellent. And Kate Cooper had anticipated in the comments your tax what you want less of. So we're in a consensus on that one, I think.
I should say I find it hard to concentrate on what I'm saying and read the comments at the same time. So I don't see the comments and the questions. So any heckles and electronic tomatoes not well directed into the chat.
Well, no tomatoes as yet. We have a question from Craig Harvey who says, is it true the actual fuel excise collected is less than the amount spent on roads anyway, thus disproving the it pays for roads myth?
Some colleagues looked at this recently. So just based on what I said, if fuel tax is about 30 billion a year, from memory, all government's road spending is about 40 or 45 billion. That's state and federal. But that money comes from a whole range of places. It comes from registration fees. It comes from stamp duties on vehicle sales. We raise money in lots of ways that pay for lots of things. And the idea that one tax pays for one thing is generally pretty simplistic. We do have things like the Medicare levy that pays for Medicare, and it is really appealing politically. And I think it's to some degree it's a good thing for transparency. To have some taxes that are dedicated to some things. And look, if a government wanted to say we are going to fund roads just from fuel tax so that we're entirely transparent about this, and we're going to crank fuel tax to do that, okay, if they want to do that, but that's not actually what they're doing at the moment. And so in the reality that we're living in at the moment, we don't fund roads from fuel tax. So there you go.
Yeah. Sam Hall has a slightly longer question/comment. Super funds could advocate for reduction of fossil fuel subsidies in the interest of the long-term performance of their diversified portfolios by reducing performance drag from climate change risk. Have you interacted with super funds or other investors on this / engaging policymakers on similar issues?
So that's a really good point. I mean, no is the quick answer. But you know, if people or if individuals, or if there was a campaign to tell super funds that to tell the government, or to tell the government to reform this, or super funds to crack down on companies like BHP and Rio, who fund the Minerals Council, who are lobbying against this, I think that'd be great. So no, I haven't personally engaged, and I don't think the Australian Institute's engaged with super funds at much of a level on this, but there certainly has been investor, the idea of investor engagement on some of these issues. There certainly has been. Our colleagues at Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility have done some great work lobbying BHP and Rio Tinto around their funding of the Minerals Council and the Minerals Council's problematic stance on a lot of climate issues. So that's been done, and so maybe that's an avenue through which this could be done. You're right. I should bring it up with our friends over there.
Great. There have been a couple of questions about SUVs and whether what kinds of tax credits are offered to big dumb utes, as we sometimes
Look, we're friends
refer
here.
to them.
We're friends here. We can call them big dumb cars. That's actually a bit of a. We've done research on this. It's a slightly different issue. And again, do you want to call a tax break that facilitates people buying less fuel efficient cars? Do you want to call that a fossil fuel subsidy? Maybe in our $14.5 billion number. But yeah, big dumb utes are exempt from luxury car tax. So your Ram 1500s and your Chevrolet, can't remember what it's called, those cars, those big trucks, utes, trucks, call them what you like, they can cost $250,000. That's not what a tradie spends on a ute. Your average Nissan, a Toyota Hilux or something, you're looking at max sort of 70, 80 grand. So luxury car tax only kicks in over, I think it's 90 grand. So yeah, vehicles that can carry more in load than they can in passengers. So basically, if you can fit more in the tray than you would carry passengers, get exemptions from the luxury car tax. And our estimate was that exemption costs $250 million a year, and it makes our roads less safe. So there's another thing that should be phased out, and I'd love to see phased out in the next parliament. But yeah, it's not actually included in our sum there. Maybe we'll think about including it next year.
Excellent. Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. But Rod, just to let you know, Jay Wilson says if being an economist doesn't work out, then maybe you should try being a stand-up comedian, because he's found you pretty funny today. Thanks everyone for coming along.
All economists are actually comedians that just didn't quite make it on the stage.
All their
How many economists
material.
does it take to wallpaper a room, Alice?
Have to put a model.
No, it depends how thinly you can slice them.
Oh. All right. I've been promising that there would be PowerPoints from Policy School on our website for a few weeks now. They are officially up there, and the PowerPoint from this presentation will also go on the Policy School page of the Australia Institute website. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube to catch all of our webinars. You can also follow our podcasts, Follow the Money, Dollars and Cents, and After America. The first book from Australia Institute Press is just about out in the world. It's called What's the Big Idea? And you can order that on our website. And
That
if you have
Alice
any...
did all the work for.
Thank you. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can email us mail@australiainstitute.org.au, and please put Policy School in the subject. Thanks so much, Rod, and thanks everyone for coming along today.
Thanks, Alice. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.